Hello, and welcome to episode 9 of Humanism Now, the podcast from the Central London Humanists for anybody active or just curious about humanism. I'm your host, James, and this week we will be discussing more misconceptions about humanism, how apostasy is viewed in the asylum system, and what are some of the funny aspects of humanism. To discuss all of this and more, I'm delighted to be joined by two of our regular panelists here. Nicole Shashar with the Leicester Humanists. How are you today?
Hello, I'm doing very well, thank you. Yeah, enjoying
And
that.
how's everything going with the Leicester Humanists?
Very well, thank you. Yeah, I don't think I've had much news since the last time I was on. But yeah, we're racking up people registering for our events next month, so that should be good.
Excellent. And in North London, fellow committee member with Central London Humanists, Mark Agathangelou.
Hi, James. Yeah, delighted to be here. Looking forward to it. And also, I've just completed very slowly a very long book about the history of humanism.
Excellent. Now, we finished last week with an audience question about misconceptions and taboos about humanism. And after that episode was published, it sparked a lot of conversation and feedback from our members and listeners. So we thought we'd actually spend a bit more time going into some of those common critiques or common misconceptions that fellow humanist members have received. And one area in particular that came up quite a lot was the perception of how humanists view people who believe in God or people who are religious. Lots of interesting experiences and feedback to share. Mark, I know you were not involved in last week's discussion. What are some of the misconceptions that you've heard, particularly relating to how humanists view religious people?
Yeah, something that I've picked up on, which I think is something which causes quite a lot of concern for humanists, particularly those of us working in sort of humanist groups, volunteers and activists, if you like, as opposed to maybe to some of the more sort of high-powered celebrity humanists, is this conception that humanism is very antipathetic towards all religion, and that that we think all religious people are deluded at best and or indeed potentially stupid, which is obviously not the case. And I think that's something which causes quite a lot of hurt. It's religious people, even quite moderately religious people, will feel that they're being insulted, and everyday humanists, if you like certainly like myself, can feel that there's a hostility towards us because of this misconception that we are very aggressively anti, not just religion, but religious people.
Yeah, I think that idea that this feedback that we think religious people are stupid is one I've heard quite a lot, which I think we do need to make sure we don't give off that perception. I mean, one, it's demonstrably not true. It's not the case that belief or disbelief is in any way correlated with intelligence. And two, it's just unhelpful towards having constructive dialogue. And, I know a lot of our members are involved in interfaith dialogue, and that's very important, I think, to a lot of humanists. So, yeah, I'm not familiar with anyone who is particularly patronizing or looks down on those with religious beliefs. I think broadly, people tend to identify with being humanists because they are curious about these questions, the same questions that religious people are interested in. People who are not religious, but not interested, tend not to call themselves humanist because they don't feel the need to identify in that way. Nicole, you're involved in interfaith work. What feedback do you tend to get?
Obviously, with interfaith, humanists tend to be the only non-religious and non-theistic philosophy that is represented, even though we are far from that. And I think that some religious people are worried, they are concerned that we won't like them, that we're not interested, that we think they're stupid or not worth talking to. But as we all know, that couldn't be further from the truth. Like you said, James, humanists are interested in these things, even though we might disagree where somebody lands, be like, okay, you believe in God, I don't. But that doesn't matter. because it's interesting how people come to these things and what people get from them. And that's it. It's like the human understanding of religion is, I think, what a lot of humanists are very interested in, and what it means to people. And ultimately, humanism is a compassionate, empathetic philosophy. So it's about seeing the people first and seeing what we do have in common. Something that's really beneficial doing interfaith stuff. I think some people think that we're going to be this angry atheist storming in, being like, show me evidence for God to all these people. And of course we're not. It's, oh, do you work at the food bank at the Saturday? That's really lovely. I also care about charity. You know, it's what we have in common rather than what divides us in interfaith. And I think it's a really powerful thing.
Absolutely, yes. The angry atheist trope is certainly one that I think we've all faced a lot. Has anyone encountered that assumption that we're being intentionally antagonistic in being openly and outwardly humanist?
I've certainly heard about this. I mean, I know a humanist group, not our one, but another one that I've been involved with, where they, you know, I've heard reports that is what people have experienced, and they go out of their way to say that we're not angry atheists. I think it's interesting that also that there was this sort of new humanist, new atheist, so to speak, moment, which did bring quite a lot of people into humanism, and maybe to some extent there's almost a confusion between atheism and humanism, that if you don't believe in God and if you're actively opposed religious privilege, then that makes you a humanist, but it doesn't necessarily. There's more to being a humanist than that, isn't there? So but I think maybe that moment has passed, and when we had our poet Alex Williams, didn't we, talking about the angry atheists and how it's exciting, but it's probably counterproductive to adopt that type of antagonistic approach. But I certainly find when I'm involved with sort of a health-related group, a support group, and I'm quite careful about mentioning humanism, even though other people will talk about how faith and religion helps them in managing a long-term condition. I'm a bit wary of saying anything because I don't want to put people off, that they might think that I'm therefore implicitly critical of their beliefs, which I don't make a judgment, and if it's helping them, then great.
Yes, exactly. I think that's why it falls into the misconceptions category, because again, I think most people who identify as humanist are generally quite respectful of religions, and probably also looking to how can we replicate some of the good parts of religious community, charity, belonging and support, for example, whilst not adhering to some of the more prescriptive beliefs.
I think that partly where this might come from is a lot of people, and this is myself included, read things like The God Delusion when we was an angry, angsty teenager anyway. And then you kind of get this like, yeah, amazing. You get this kind of like ire behind you about like, but it's misplaced. If anyone applied that to random religious people, that's not where like your ire about the world should be applied for. But I think most people, and certainly everyone who considers themselves a humanist, calms down if they ever had an angry atheist phase. But not every adult atheist or someone who doesn't have faith does.
Yes, I think with all of those books that came out around that period, and there's been a lot written since, there is also a risk of judging entire religious groups by particular bad examples. And I think that's what we're trying to counter here in talking about not wanting all humanists to be judged by the worst cases of angry atheists. So it's important to also consider that when there's criticisms of religions as a whole, or some of the worst elements of certain actions, or particular individuals within a group, that you shouldn't also view an entire group just because of what's been written. Now, another area that came up quite a lot was, I think, more well-intentioned misunderstandings. Particularly what was cited was Yuval Noah Harari's writings in both Sapiens and Homo Deus on the definition of humanism, which is, of course, I think, I don't think he's the first to write in this way, but it's certainly one of the most cited sources for quite a big misunderstanding for just what humanism is definitionally. Nicole, I know you shared these comments in the chat before. Do you mind just running through some of the misunderstandings that appear?
Absolutely, yes. So he starts with the idea. He's like, humanists believe, and this is what we don't believe. He says that Homo sapiens has a unique and sacred nature that is fundamentally different from the nature of all other beings and phenomena. And I think any people who are well versed in humanism listening to this will be like, that is kind of the opposite of what humanists believe. We don't actually think that that human beings are in any way this sort of unique phenomena to the world, that we're outside nature. We do actually very much believe that we are just a product of nature. And of course, we've done amazing things, but it's not some inherent thing that makes us different. His biggest thing is the idea that we worship humans. And of course, we don't. Humanists don't worship anything, but particularly not humans or the things humans have done. We can be amazed and inspired and in awe of the things that humans have done. But to call it worshipping is completely wrong. Whether or not he's got that because of the name, I know that humanism, that's what, when people have never heard of it, that's a misconception I hear quite a lot. They're like, oh, do you worship humans? But of course we don't.
It's very common, I think, as a criticism from religious groups. I think they view, again, I think some of this has come from being spread quite well online by people who want to purposely mislead people to what humanism is. But I've heard this idea a lot from religious people, that they view that the concept of humanism, the reason that human is in the name, is that we're replacing God or gods with humans, and that we should take that place, and that whether that constitutes worship or just, as you say, a privileged place amongst the environment. It's not something I've encountered when talking with fellow humanists, that anybody would hold that view.
I think also he's, the assumptions he's making around not just that, the idea that we worship humans and our unique and special abilities, but also this idea that we have a project to perfect humans and I mean, certainly. No, I think probably most movements of philosophical or cultural, political, have an aspiration towards improving society in some way, and making life better, and helping people to flourish and make the most of themselves. I mean, I don't see there's anything sinister or perverse in that at all. But I think what there's a bit of sleight of hand here is where you take something like that and you say, aha, therefore. If you want to improve society, therefore, what you actually want to do is to sort of, through eugenics and sort of indoctrination and totalitarian control, you want to sort of make everybody better in some way. I mean, that is just pure distortion, frankly. And I mean, the one, I think for me, the essence of humanism is we like to discuss, we're rational, we believe in looking at the evidence, talking it through, interrogating it. Which is not to say we don't also have emotions as well, but that comes into it clearly. But so we're the opposite of dogmatics. We're the opposite of totalitarian. I mean, democracy is right there. If you go to the Humanist UK definitions, it's front and center, because we believe everybody is equal and has a right to express their views rather than have things imposed on them. So liberty is central. So I just think it's. Well, I'm not going to use the word I'm really thinking, but I think it's balderdash, personally.
Yeah, and I think that point on the idea that we're trying to perfect or even improve humans, there's some confusion with the growing idea of transhumanism that is developing more of a following online now, which is, I think there are potentially in the Venn diagram, there's a crossover of people who would fall into both, but I see it as completely a different movement.
Yeah, exactly. It's just maybe it's a genuine confusion because of the name, or perhaps it's opportunistic.
Nicole, do you have anything to add on the Harari piece?
Yes, yeah. So he also has this idea that Nazism and Stalinism are somehow rooted in humanist ideas, and that the destruction that those philosophies and the people within them brought are somehow related to humanism. And he said that humanism is responsible for an age of intense religious fervour, unparalleled missionary efforts, and the bloodiest wars of religion in history. And again, I think it's quite apparent from what we said already that is the exact opposite and the exact antithesis of the humanist outlook. And again, it's this equating anything that's atheistic with humanism. So Stalinism was non-religious and had nothing to do with God, but it certainly wasn't humanist in any way. And even just the very basic understanding of humanism, of those kind of three things, one of them is being a nice person and thinking about how other people feel. That's kind of a really big part of a humanist outlook. And to then make it so like, oh, so the Nazis and Stalin, like they were influenced by that. I was like, well,
I think this is one of the most dangerous misconceptions in the book, and one of the most has caused the most damage. And again, this was countered, I think, in The God Delusion 25 years ago. There's a whole chapter on the common feedback of, weren't Stalin and Hitler, weren't they both atheists? And you're right, Stalin certainly was, most probably was, or considered himself to be a god. Hitler probably, or almost certainly wasn't by most historical accounts. But the point is that I think people view it as in order to act those kind of atrocities, then there must be an absence of a religious belief, which is, again, it's not correlated really. But it is odd that it appears within Sapiens, because it's, I think we were discussing beforehand. Otherwise, it seems to be such an excellent book, and then you read those chapters, and it makes you doubt the credibility of what else is involved within.
It's interesting that he refers to these sort of bloody religious wars being in the 20th century, and I suppose there's an element of irony in that, and that these are non-religious. But I think the sort of the clue to this misconception or misrepresentation is in those very words, because he's saying that implicitly religion is good and atheism or humanism is bad, and yet he's describing these wars as religious wars. So in a sense, he's labeling humanists as being like religious. So I don't really it's a very confused point he's making, and it's also another clue in that is there have been some terrible religious wars. Is he therefore saying that a philosophy or a movement which is associated in any way with conflict and warfare and human suffering is a bad thing? Because on that basis, you would say that religion is a bad thing, because there's been lots and lots of extremely bloody religious genocides and terrible wars. So, but I don't think we wouldn't therefore blame. Go to our local church and start sort of yelling at them and saying that they were responsible for terrible bloodshed. I mean, it just doesn't really make any sense.
Mm. And I think to pick up on a point you made there, Nicole, there was a very interesting section on the online course that Humanists UK have published about an introduction to humanism. I think it's under one of Andrew Copson's video sections on there, where he's talking about what are the either political or other groups that are against are anti-humanist in their nature. And of course, it talks a lot about dogmatic religion, but I think he also mentions in there that any form of state atheism is also non-humanistic. The idea of banning religion is also against what we believe, in the same way that enforced belief would be as well.
That's it. And I think that is another misconception people have about secularism, which is something that humanists are passionate about. It's not about banning religion for all individuals. It's about keeping it completely separate so that people have a completely free choice, and that no religion gets any domination over any other, or those with non-belief. But I've heard of that as a misconception when we say, like, we want a completely secular government, that's what we should be aiming for. But they're like, but that's anti-religious. Like, it's not. It's actually beneficial to most religious people.
Yeah, I think we could do a whole other episode on what secularism actually means as well, because I think if you look at the French approach to secularism versus the US approach to secularism, both secular constitutions, but completely different approaches to creating a secular society. So, yeah, absolutely agree. And I think that leads on nicely to the third broad category of feedback that we got. And that really ties humanism to specific political beliefs or other movements as well. Mark, I know you're actively involved and a follower of politics. So what did you pick up on in terms of how others perceive humanist as in terms of its role, its interaction with political views?
Yeah, so I think there are a lot of assumptions around humanism and humanists being inherently sort of left of centre, and I think that there is an element of truth in this, insofar as humanism's sort of evolution has been very much a sort of progressive human rights sort of based organisation, and there has been some sort of natural convergence in the past between sort of conservative values and religious values. There's an element of truth in that. But at the same time, of course, you can also see things like, the fact that the Labour Party had its origins in the nonconformist movement. So it cuts both ways. So it's not simplistic link between religion and more sort of right-wing politics. But I find, for me, it's one of the strengths of the humanist movement, that a lot of people are broadly progressive, but you don't really get quizzed about your actual politics, really. I mean, people are much more interested in specific issues and values rather than it being factional or, very much sort of, having to sort of identify yourself with a particular individual or policy agenda. So it's actually a strength, I think, that we can discuss these issues, and there are people from across the political spectrum in reality within the humanist movement. It's not just people who are left of centre.
Yeah, that's a really good point, and I think that that's something I really value about the way humanists are, and I think it's something that's really important to me, is this idea that's like not accepting just everything as a package. Whether that's someone's told you they've voted for some party, being like, oh, so you must be this and this and this. Or even if they're like a member of that party and really into it, it doesn't mean that they condone every single thing that party does or says, or all the members of it. It also doesn't mean that we as individuals, we shouldn't be like, oh, I broadly agree with what this party says, but we can admit like, oh, actually, but this thing they've said I really don't like, and I like what this party says. It's like not accepting just a bucket of ideas of you're this, so you're this, and then ignore everyone else who says they're from the other because they're like the other. I think it's if more people thought that way in a more balanced way and didn't, rather than putting the label on first of what they are, whether it's political party or political ideology or leaning, it's like first principles, really. It's look around, decide, and then you can say, oh, I'm broadly this because I believe this, but there's no need to label it, and you can be fluid. And
yeah, absolutely. I think that's it's almost like we look at the strengths and the commonalities rather than trying to find where we disagree and then adopt an antagonistic stance. So it's much more inclusive, and it allows for that debate around issues. And you do hear, I mean, a lot of, in different settings, and particularly in our pub social, you'll hear a lot of different opinions expressed. And we have disagreements about things. We're not, we don't all sit around like perfect beings discussing things in a completely rational way with never losing our temper. It does. We do have disagreements, and there is a diversity of opinion within humanists, and I think that's a strength.
Yeah, it's almost definitional as well, isn't it? That humanists we're open to discussion and debate, and we want to hear as many opinions as possible. So it does make it difficult in terms of aligning on issues sometimes, but I would agree. Although I would say this is perhaps one area where I think I have heard pushback from within the group, let's say, of I think there are so one example, Mark organised a very good discussion event for our group earlier this year involving Neil Garrett, who's a Conservative member of the London Assembly and also a member of Humanists UK. And I think there were definitely members who felt that, who were, not that they didn't think that he belonged within the movement, but were very keen to push back on some of those views and wanted him to align more towards the majority, as you say, generally more likely to be liberal progressive. But I think, and Humanists UK have been involved him in the conference as well. And I think it's important that we have a diverse range of opinions there. Because I think the other slightly connected bit of feedback that I thought was interesting was this idea as well that this is more of a sort of intellectual and middle class demographic who are sort of, just thinking about these things in intellectual terms and not really that involved in the understanding of, day-to-day issues.
Yeah, I think we there is a little bit of truth in that. I think insofar as that humanism often has attracted people who are quite highly educated and interested in. Well, we talk about books a lot. We talk about we discuss various as alluded to here. We're fairly literary, but on the other hand, the ideas apply to anybody. They're not restricted to any particular demographic. And I think one of the things that we've been doing more recently in central London is try to broaden out the appeal and make some of our activities as inclusive as possible and as accessible as possible. I know that James is organising a comedy event coming up in December, which is it couldn't be more fun and inclusive and something for everybody than that.
Yeah, I think that, like you said, I think that the sorts of people who are attracted to humanism often are the people who kind of like over-intellectualizing things, but that's not what the movement is, and this is the thing. And I think lots of people enjoy that part of it, but it's also just having fun, going to a comedy show, having community. Because like we were saying earlier on, if we're kind of looking to the really good things about religion and trying to encourage humanism is more about that. Within religious groups, there'll be some people who love reading the holy books or going and listening and analysing it, and there'll be some people who just want to turn up and sing. And I think that if we had a bit more of that in humanism, I think we might have a broader appeal.
Yeah, definitely, much more turning up and singing. Just one more point to end on the political side of things. Perhaps a more recent development in terms of misunderstandings I know that I've experienced. I'd be interested to hear from the panel if you've had something similar. Is I had a experience recently of mentioning to someone that I'm a humanist, and they replied with saying, "Oh, is that like saying all lives matter or being a men's rights activist?" Which again is almost it sounds like an intentional misunderstanding of the term, but I do worry that this is something that might develop.
Yes, I've heard this recently. And I was surprised as well because I hadn't heard that and for quite a long time while since being involved in humanism. But in case any listens, so the whole all lives matter thing, it was introduced as a counterpoint to Black Lives Matter. But obviously the reason that it's Black Lives Matter was that certain things were happening to Black people that weren't happening to other people. And the humanism thing was used by, or has been used, is currently being used by some kind of anti-feminist people who are like, for that exact thing, they're like, oh, I'm not a feminist, I'm a humanist, as in like, oh, I should just care about everyone. But of course, as I'm sure most people listening know, that feminism is not anti-man at all. It is for everyone. But it's also, and then humanism is not in opposition to that. It's a completely different root of the word.
Yeah, there is misconception and there is deliberate misrepresentation for various political purposes. Yeah, I think that to me it feels like there is no contradiction, because the humanist values are that everybody should be treated fairly and equally and humanely and have their rights respected. And that's completely compatible with Black Lives Matter and feminism, because we're all people, aren't we? And so I don't see. I think there's a strange framing to try to sort of say, well, if you believe all lives matter in a general sense, therefore that's incompatible with believing that actually we should tackle racism or institutional discrimination against women. It's I can't follow that argument at all.
I think it's that people have misconstrued it as explicitly not calling yourself a feminist specifically and calling yourself a humanist instead. And there will be lots of bad faith actors within that who are anti-feminists who are saying that. And it's not that they actually, and a lot of them don't actually know that humanism is a thing, is an established philosophy that's old and that lots of people follow. I think they're just using it as like, oh, I'm not like pro-feminine, I'm pro-human. So I think most people saying that probably don't know what humanism actually is.
It goes back to what you were saying before, wasn't it, about misunderstanding the name? Yeah,
I think it probably has its roots in people using it in a bad faith way, but it potentially gets picked up, as you say, and misunderstood more broadly. But let's hope that we can work towards making sure that humanism becomes that catch-all term to say that we support all of these equality and progressive causes. Well, Nicole, Mark, thank you very much for your thoughts on that topic. I think we have plenty more to talk about in future episodes. And we'll be right back after this week's interview.
Hi, my name is Lucy Potter and I'm a researcher based at the University of Sheffield. I am currently conducting research on how asylum claims on the grounds of non-religiosity, which can include apostasy and blasphemy, are handled by the UK government. I am looking for refugees or people who are still seeking asylum on these grounds to take part in an interview with me on their experiences of the asylum system. This research is really important because there is no research on how non-religious asylum claims are dealt with currently, and not much is known about non-religious persecution more widely. If you take part in this research, you will remain anonymous and unidentifiable, and I hope this research will make the asylum system inclusive of all belief systems, and I encourage anyone with experience to please contact me. My email is lpotter2@sheffield.ac.uk. Thank you.
Lucy Potter is a PhD candidate at the University of Sheffield, focusing on migration research within the Department of Sociology. And she joins us today to talk about her latest project, focused on asylum research within the UK as relates to apostasy and blasphemy. Lucy, thank you so much for joining Humanism Now.
Thank you for having me.
Before we start, I think our listeners will have heard a little bit about you because we've had played the advert or the announcement of your research on the last few episodes. Could you just give us a bit of background to yourself and how you came to be interested broadly in sociology and particularly in this current area of research?
Yeah, great. Thank you. So I guess my academic journey started when I studied philosophy. And I went into sociology mainly because philosophy is very sort of theory based, a lot of reading, but not necessarily research. And I really wanted to go out into the field and like work with participants and do that qualitative research. So I went on to a master's in sociology. And then during my master's, I really picked up research interest in migration and asylum specifically. And yeah, just the interest grew from there. Asylum is really interesting and ultimately kind of want to improve the system. So that's how I sort of got into this area. And then in terms of the project itself, it is it's a collaborative PhD. So it's working with a human rights organisation, Humanists UK, who they sort of acknowledged that there was this gap in knowledge, and there's no academic research onto it. So that's where I sort of stepped in as the researcher on it.
Fantastic. Yeah, our listeners will be very familiar with Humanists UK, or should be by this point. And how about your upbringing or background? Did you have a religious upbringing, or were you someone who are you finding out about these topics afresh through the research?
Yeah, good question. So I had like a Catholic upbringing, not too serious. I had a lot of freedom to sort of delve in and out of it. But it was more like, I went to all Catholic schools. My mum's Catholic, my dad's Church of England, but yeah, just not a very religious household. So as I moved on to uni, kind of explored other options, haven't been overly religious myself. And yeah, I would describe myself more as agnostic more than anything. I only actually heard of the term humanism when I started the project. So yeah, I've sort of acknowledged myself as agnostic, non-religious, but yeah, the term humanist haven't really came across it. I don't know the reasons for that. I don't know if it's just because I'm young or just haven't been overly interested in that sort of thing until now. But yeah, so I've been learning as I go along about what humanism is, other sort of alternative worldviews. Yeah.
No, I think it's extremely common, as you mentioned, to not know of the term humanism until presented with it. We've had quite a lot of stories from our members and guests about how they came to learn about it, often through close involvement like yourself, or celebrations, weddings and baby namings and funerals. It seems to be another key area that the word is spreading, but it's good that people are discovering it in more different ways. And so what inspired this specific project when we're talking about apostasy and asylum, and what are the aims that you're looking to discover?
So the project really started with Humanists UK a few years ago. So they noticed from the support that they offer to people seeking asylum that there were these repeated problems or misunderstandings with how non-religious asylum claims were being handled by the Home Office, in terms of the credibility assessment, and the way they sort of ask non-religious people to make sort of sense of their non-religious beliefs. So they didn't really know how to test it because they have to use like objective measures, and they weren't asking, say, the sort of correct questions. So one of the examples are that I think a lot of the listeners would know, and it's a well-publicized case, is the Pakistani humanist who was quizzed on Aristotle and Plato. Do you not know that?
I'm not familiar with this case, no. Please. It'd be great to find out more about that.
Okay, so a Pakistani humanist was asked to name ancient Greek philosophers who were humanist, and that was a way of testing their humanist beliefs. And their case was denied because they didn't mention, and this is what the Home Office said, Plato or Aristotle, both of which were religious. So
yeah, I think it's not even commonly believed that they would qualify as humanists, nor was humanism really a thing when they were around.
Exactly. So bearing in mind, not a lot of for a lot of people who do philosophy or are humanists would even know what ancient Greek philosophers practiced it. It's just not common knowledge. I did a philosophy degree and wouldn't even know that. So they're expecting someone to know that, for one. And then for two, the Plato and Aristotle both being religious, it just showed this huge misunderstandings on what humanists believe or practice, and, just a complete disregard of what sort of humanism is. So this was the case that it was, it started a lot of lobbying and advocacy work with Humanists UK. So yeah, if there will be articles online about it and stuff like that. So after that case, they started to, there was training at the Home Office that wanted to train caseworkers and decision makers on freedom of religion or belief. And a part of that was non-religious cases being fed into it to sort of, build on that understanding going forward. But yeah, since then, there hasn't been a continuation of this training. I think it was just a one-time training, and there's still been sort of these misunderstandings in asylum cases. So this research is to explore the barriers that people face, and because there's no academic research on it either, to fill that gap in knowledge.
Okay, so I know you're not at the point of publishing the findings yet, but so far, what have been the general themes that you found, or initial conclusions that you can come to?
Yeah, so the point in research that I'm at, I should probably explain. So the PhD is 3 years. I'm in my second year. So second year is where you undertake your field work. And I'm nearing towards the end of that now. So hopefully December time, I should have most, if not all, the sort of data in. And then I'll have a time where I analyze that. But at the moment, so I've done interviews with human rights advocates, so lawyers, people who work for NGOs, academics, and then also refugees who have claimed on these grounds. And I think so. Some of the findings are highlighting these barriers that non-religious people face. So one that I've already mentioned is the issue with the credibility assessment. So issues with objectively testing subjective beliefs. And then to also highlight that non-religious people or humanists don't have any like set doctrines that they follow. They don't go to churches and stuff like that, which is what maybe Christian converts are tested on. So humanists and non-religious people don't have these things. So it's really hard to test and really hard to supply evidence as well, because you have to supply evidence for having a fear of persecution or being persecuted. But if a lot of people have a fear of being persecuted, but their belief is subjective and something they might not have expressed out loud, then they have no evidence for this. So it's highlighting that struggle of evidence that you have to supply, because the Home Office want to see objective evidence that they can test. So that's also one of the issues. And then you've also got sort of issues with people who tend to come to the UK to study, and then they start to develop they can explore different religions or beliefs in society. It's a different sort of way of life, and then their beliefs change when they're in the UK. So you've got those issues when you go to the Home Office. You make it's called an asylum claim surplus, where you're in a country for the period of time, and then the situation changes at home. So you've got issues with the Home Office, asking why are you claiming asylum when you've already been in the UK or you've been away from home for a certain time, and having to explain why your beliefs have changed. But it's really hard to explain, because it's just an inner feeling, and especially for younger people as well, to explain coherently their philosophical beliefs. It's really hard to articulate that when you haven't done it before. And especially religion as well, when religion has played such a huge role in growing up and a huge role in your way of life. When you start to abandon that, lots of people have, like a really crises with it. It's really groundbreaking, and it really affects like their mental health as well. So that going to claiming asylum might be the last thing on their mind, or the way they claim asylum just isn't clear how to do that for them. So yeah, those are some of the issues. And then others are when they have their interviews, the Home Office supply or hire interpreters and translators for some clients that need it. However, there's been huge problems with this, because sometimes the interpreter or the translator is from a certain religious background or from their country of origin, and some have incorrectly or misleadingly translated concepts of religion or belief, either because they either don't know the language of the terms, or because they don't want to say anything blasphemous themselves.
Right, of course, yeah.
And these are huge issues. And where this has happened, people either have things incorrectly translated, which then has a knock-on effect with their asylum claim, because anything inconsistent, it'll be rejected.
There's so much to consider there. There's so many areas and so many grey areas, I think, where this can become an issue. Because I would imagine for most people as well, this is all part of a long process. It's not that they overnight choose to leave their faith. And I think, as you mentioned yourself, many people may prefer not to associate with the term atheist. They may not be familiar with the term humanist. They might not have anything that a term that appropriately reflects how they feel. They may just be experiencing doubts. Is that again something which can be problematic? Is even expressing doubts sufficient, or is that where it becomes a bit more of a grey area?
Yeah, this is a really difficult. Like, this is what makes these cases so complex. The participants that I have mostly spoken to, I've accessed them through Humanists UK, and that those type of people are humanist. They're very outwardly non-religious. They might have even done activism work. They might be bloggers online and stuff like that, and they have a very sort of passionate activist role. But the other side to it is, who I don't necessarily have access to these type of people, are people who are just taking on more secular views, and they might not necessarily be atheists. They might just have these more secular views or parts of religion that they don't necessarily like to follow. Or for some people, it might be more cultural. But for these sort of beliefs in a particular country might be deemed blasphemous. They might get in trouble for it, because the boundaries for blasphemy can be just so tight. Any sort of comment that might be an insult to religion can be deemed blasphemy. So the stakes are really high. So it's hard. So then when you're in the asylum system, I mean, a lot of people don't know that apostasy is a grounds for asylum. So they might choose sort of other grounds. But these sort of secular, more cultural aspects is something that people can face blasphemy for. But, it's so tricky to sort of measure that.
Again, I know you're only partway through, but I'm wondering, are there implications outside of the UK for the research that you've conducted so far?
Yes, I think so. So even though it's UK based, this is the first piece of research to look at non-religious asylum claims, to the best of my knowledge, worldwide. So any sort of examples of these cases and the barriers that non-religious people face, I think will be applicable in other contexts. And there is a huge need to do this type of research. So if this research can encourage that in other contexts, then that would also be great. And as well as the asylum system. So the asylum systems, like across Europe, can be quite similar. I'm not an expert in them, but I think the way that they assess the claims are quite similar. So the look around policy and practice of these cases, I think, would also be applicable elsewhere. And then in terms of that training that I mentioned that the Home Office do, I don't think, or to the best of my knowledge, any other European governments do that. So in that sense, the UK is actually quite pioneering in that training. So if I could look into that and see what the training involves and if it's having an effect on asylum claims, then that is going to be beneficial as well for other governments to take on and to do.
Absolutely, yeah. Well, certainly, we'll definitely have to have you back on once you've finalised the research and published the findings, because I think, absolutely, this is something which is relevant globally at the moment. You mentioned still more to do, and you've spoken with a wide range of people involved in the system. Who are you still keen to speak with, and how can people get in touch with you if they would be willing to participate?
Yes, thank you. So I would love to encourage anyone who has claimed asylum on these grounds, or where apostasy has formed part of their asylum claim, to get involved. Can't stress enough how important it is to have people with that lived experience involved in the research and help shape it, because you will help shape the findings and ultimately, hopefully, help improve the system for other people. So anyone who's had experience with these types of asylum claims to get involved. I also want to specifically encourage women. So at the minute, my particular participants are quite male dominated. So I'd love to encourage any women to take part and share their experiences as well. Just a little bit of information on what taking part means. It will include an interview. So really informal chat with myself, and you will be made anonymous and unidentifiable in the research. So you can feel free to take part and know that you won't be identified to anyone. And we will discuss your experiences with the asylum system and any sort of suggestions for improvement. And you can contact me on my Sheffield email address, which is lpotter2@sheffield.ac.uk. And yeah, just give me an email and I'll have a introductory call to you, and I can answer any questions as well.
Wonderful. And what's the timeline now? And what are you planning for the remainder of the research? And when can we expect to hear about your conclusions?
I hope to have the bulk of my interviews done by December. So really encourage people to get in contact with me as soon as possible. And then the next steps would be to analyse it all. And then in February next year, or this year coming, I have a year left. So I'll be writing up my thesis, which I think is around 80,000 words. And then after that, I want to be working with the collaborative partner, Humanists UK, in disseminating the research. So I am thinking of writing a report with them and disseminating the research as wide as possible. I'm working with NGOs and secular organisations in lobbying for the findings, and hopefully taking it to the Home Office as well. That would be great. But yeah, publishing as many papers as possible.
Fantastic. And just before we go, what is something that you've changed your mind on recently, either as part of this research or otherwise? Okay,
yeah. I think in terms of the research, so when I first started, I knew little about this area in terms of non-religious claims for asylum, because it's quite a niche topic. So when I first started, I thought that it was going to be quite clear that it was just on the religion grounds. So you have like multiple grounds for asylum. I thought it was just going to be like under religion, but actually, as I have gone through the fieldwork process, apostasy is quite often intersected with other grounds. So lots of people have claimed it with a political grounds for asylum, because leaving a religion is quite a political move in some places, as well as sexuality claims, quite often linked with that, and gender-based persecution as well. So yeah, it's really not as clear cut as just being religion. It's really intersected, and that just goes to show that, people's identities are so complex and so unique. It's often not as clear cut as one thing. So yeah, that's what I've changed my mind, I think, on.
That makes sense, and it does sound as though, is it right to say that most claims people have to choose one quite narrow identity feature in which to base the claim on, or are people warming to this idea of taking more of a overall look at someone's overall mix of personality or identity, and how that could combine together to contribute to the claim?
Yeah, so I think you can claim on as many sort of grounds as possible, and there are pure just religion-based claims where apostasy will be linked in, but where things are merged with others, it's the Home Office tend to focus on the one that they have more knowledge on. So if they have more information or training and knowledge on, say, sexuality-based claims, they tend to focus all their assessments on that ground. So, yeah, but I don't know if that's necessarily the right thing to do. But if someone is claiming on apostasy as well as other things, that should be taken into consideration as well. And I think when they're focusing on other grounds, then perhaps that shows a sort of lack of understanding of apostasy claims that I think needs addressing.
Well, it just shows the importance of the work that you're doing. So, Lucy Potter, thank you so much for everything that you've been, all the research that you've been conducting. Wishing you the best of luck with it, and we look forward to welcoming you back once everything's published. Thanks for your time.
Thank you, James. Thank you for having me.
Welcome back to Humanism Now. I'm here again with Nicole and Mark, and we've just listened to that excellent interview with Lucy Potter, who's doing some fantastic work. Really insightful stuff. Nicole, what stood out for you there?
Yeah, there was something really interesting when she was talking about a Pakistani humanist who was trying to claim asylum in the UK, and they were asked about naming ancient Greek philosophers and asked questions about Plato and Aristotle. And it kind of feeds into the misconceptions that we were talking about earlier. One, that all humanists are this kind of philosophically rooted, read every philosophy book ever, and that's where they come to this idea, which of course isn't true. And also a second one, that humanism is a fundamentally Western philosophy and Western ideology. Obviously, it has big roots in the West, just like many philosophies, but humanist ideas come up in practically every country, in any philosophical religious tradition. You get humanists in, I think, every place in the world, really. And so this idea that it's like, oh, you must read the ancient Greek philosophers, it's like, that's not what that is. It's not a good test.
Totally. And what stood out for you, Mark?
Yeah, well, just building on what Nicole said also, I mean, as we know, Plato wasn't even an atheist, so or a human. I mean, there were sort of more sort of proto-humanist thinkers, I think, sort of the Epicureans, etc. But I don't think they were on the list. But I think I was interested in the way in which she talked about the sort of the grey areas that even insofar as one can define certain people as sort of being explicitly humanist, it might not be in terms of being able to quote certain philosophers, but maybe they had been involved in an actual humanist group or a movement, or they were humanist bloggers or something like that. So there's some people who will be unequivocally, you could say, yes, they are humanists by any reasonable standard, insofar as that's the important thing. But there were others who maybe had expressed sort of humanistic values or even wanted to, but felt that they couldn't, because it was in many of these more sort of authoritarian religious regimes, the expression of anything which is in a sense contradicting that narrative, which is in some sense humanist, is prescribed and severely punished. So what do you do if you're one of those people who hasn't been sort of explicitly involved in a humanist activity, but is exhibiting humanist tendencies, or it just reveals just how difficult the position is for those sorts of people, and just felt a lot of sort of sympathy for their plight.
Yeah, how are you supposed to prove that you are having doubts, or you don't believe a certain thing, if you're not able to openly express that? It is quite a catch-22. And I think I'm glad you made the connection, Nicole, actually, to what we were discussing in the first part of the podcast, because I think it also makes the point as why getting on top of these misconceptions is important. It's not just that this is frustrating or something that only we care about within these humanist groups, but actually this really has an impact on people's lives if it's not correctly understood in society when it comes to these important decisions. Then people are going to be asked about completely the wrong things, and of course they're not going to be able to answer convincingly.
Yeah, I think it is important because it has real world consequences, and so it can seem quite abstract and even a little bit funny. People are being asked those sorts of questions, and there's also an element of, you can be asked those sorts of questions. So, for example, in the nationality test, if you're seeking British citizenship, you're asked all sorts of things which hardly any British people know the answers to. So, if we were all subjected to these sorts of tests, there would be no humanists. There would be very few British people either. So, there's something arbitrary and quite unfair about that.
It reminds me a little bit about the origins of IQ testing. And when they started doing that, their origins are quite racist, actually. And a lot of it was kind of about racial classifications in America, particularly. And a lot of it was that they would do these. It was before it was called IQ testing, I think, but they would do these tests on Black people, but people who had come from Africa, taken from Africa. And it would have things like a picture of a man kind of going like this. It's like, finish drawing what's underneath him. And is it a bike or a horse? But both of those things are cultural understandings. They're not a test of intelligence. And it's a false equivalency that you should have these pieces of cultural knowledge, which isn't true, because you can't make that up on your own. You can't invent what a bike looks like if you've never seen a bike.
I guess it just goes to show that at the time they thought that was a suitable thing to be asking, and we should also take a critical eye at what people think are suitable questions to ask now that may seem completely ridiculous in generations to come. Just to mention that Lucy will be joining our next online event organised between Central London Humanists and Faith of Faithless. That's on the 29th of November, and will feature a panel of speakers talking about similar issues for people who require support after going through apostasy or leaving faith. We'll have all the details to that and all upcoming events in the show notes. Just before we go, we have time for our mailbag question. We had an anonymous question this week asking if there were any good jokes about humanists. And we did give this some thought, and unfortunately between us haven't been able to come up with any that are directed at us. So I would like to throw this back out to our audience and issue a challenge. If anyone has any good jokes or has seen any or can share over email, jokes particularly pointed to humanists or maybe atheists in general. And as Mark mentioned earlier, we have our upcoming comedy night, our Christmas party comedy night on the 13th of December. So anyone who happens to be in London, do come along. I'm going to issue the same challenge to all of our stand-up acts to see if they can find the best way to poke fun at humanists at that event going forward. And just to mention, if you do have questions for us, please do email them to humanise.live@gmail.com. We are open to any feedback, speaker recommendations, or listener questions for our mailbag going forward. And with that, all that's left is for me to thank this week's panel. Thank you, Nicole.
Thank you so much. It's been a pleasure.
And thank you, Mark. I hope you have enough time to catch your movie.
Yes, I'm off to see Napoleon. So that's around about 3 hours of, from what I can gather, largely unhistorical thrills and spills. But I shall endeavour to watch it anyway with a non-critical eye.
We'll expect your review next time.
Definitely. Thanks, James.
And thank you very much for joining us. And we hope to see you next time on Humanism Now.